Hello, everyone, and welcome to this introduction to this week's podcast. Joe Ellis, my dear friend from Massachusetts. We had a really interesting conversation about what just happened. And, just between us, Joe is a Democratic partisan. And so I always worry a little because he's so outspokenly liberal. And even though he's, of course, absolutely entitled to that view of the world, of course, I don't think it's best for a historian to try to coalesce one's personal politics with one's historical outlook. In other words, if he were a MAGA conservative or like a George Will conservative, let's say, and he then talked about the election and saying that this is really terrible for the Constitution and the new president is doing some dangerous things that are against the rule of law and so on, that would have more credibility, of course, if he's speaking from the right and decrying this. But if you're speaking from the left, then it's easy to say, well, that's what they say, those Democrats, right? Those liberals, that's all they do. And so I'm always trying to keep it as close as possible to history and to try to provide clarification and insight rather than just whatever our opinion happens to be about what's just happened. And I do think, and I'll say this, and I say it without apology, but no person who has studied the founding generation can avoid being alarmed by what's happening. That we always thought that the norms would hold, that there would be responsible presidential deportment, that there would be no bullying or name calling, that the rule of law would be cherished, that there would be no verbal or other attacks on our basic national institutions, that we would maintain our place in the world. The politics can move us in all sorts of directions, and that's the whole point of living in a democracy. But I think that any responsible historian or citizen looking at the promise of America and the principles of America has to be alarmed by what's happening. That Donald Trump is a disruptor, he's a bloviator, but he's also deadly serious about making some revolutionary changes, and they are not all constitutional. They are not all in harmony with the rule of law. They are not all responsible from any historical point of view. In other words, if you are just a citizen of Alabama or just a citizen of Alaska or Hawaii or Massachusetts, you can have opinions about whether this is a good thing that's happening and that maybe the disruptions are important and maybe in the long run some good will come out of this and so on and so forth. I don't doubt all of that. But if you're a historian and I've spent more than 30 years reading Jefferson, listening to what's at stake, exploring the debates, the significant and very interesting and serious debates amongst the founding fathers about what's best for this country. You can't be committed in the way that I am, to the success of our republic and think that what's happening now is okay. Again, the policies might be the right ones: lower taxes, reduce regulation, force NATO to take more of the burden, pull back from America's, what I think Trump rightly calls America's endless wars. There's a lot of the policy that is just policy. That's what politics is about. I may disagree with this. I may disagree with that. That's neither here nor there. We thrive on that. That we don't want a monolithic country. We want a country where we really get down in the mud and debate things, because so much is at stake. We're the most consequential nation in the world. The world depends upon us more than most Americans will ever know. And so, of course, politics is volatile, and we accept that. It always has been. But this is really the first time that we've had a president who wants to stick it to those norms and who is indifferent to constitutional restraint and who cherishes his capacity to attack traditions that are right at the heart of the American system. I've tried so hard to be accurate, and not simply to be wild and judgmental, but to try to really sort all of this. But I can't sort it through the lens of the Founding Fathers and Thomas Jefferson without being deeply alarmed. I do think the country needs fundamental reforms. I do think Donald Trump believes that he is that reformer. I'm hoping that those reforms will be responsible and that we will move together as a people to balance the budget, to reduce the size of government, to make sure that we don't stifle economic activity, to make sure that we don't get involved in crazy military adventures around the world. I hope we will move in the direction of a quieter, gentler, somewhat more isolationist people, less prone to war, more committed to social justice. And if President Trump, for all of his kind of wild ways, can help make that happen, then I want to keep an open mind for it. So contribute to this program if you can. I still need my pickup. I'm going to be on the road beginning around May 1st. I'm going to start the big campaign at Monticello, where the Lewis and Clark expedition got its start. I'm going to travel the country. Nolan, who's the editor and producer of this program, is going to join me to do video in a number of places. Lewis and Clark is like second nature to me. I can't wait to get on the road. And our book club is about to be posted. I've chosen the first 4 books. We're going to meet on Zoom to talk about them at least every 6 weeks, and maybe more often than that. There'll be a kind of a Google Classroom where it's equivalent, where people can post their questions and their suggestions and their comments, and we can have debates about some of these questions. I want this to be a joyful exploration of how America got to this point in its extraordinary 250-year history. And so please go to ltamerica.org, read what I post, look at the videos, and forgive us for having to talk about this very difficult subject. But I don't think we can go on until we try to clarify this. And Joe Ellis certainly has earned the right to have whatever opinions he has about this amazing experiment in democracy. So let's go to the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special edition of Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkinson, and across from me is one of the people I most respect in the world, Mr. Joseph Ellis, the prize-winning, award-winning, extraordinary historian of the early national period. We haven't had you here for a while. Joe Ellis, welcome.
Hey, well, good to be back. Lots has happened since we last saw each other, and I have a feeling we're going to talk about that. But
I guess there was an election.
Yes, there was. The last time we talked, it was up in the air. Now we know that Donald Trump won, close election. And in my own judgment, the winner of the election was none of the above.
Meaning what?
Meaning 53% of the electorate didn't vote for either one of them, and they didn't vote at all. Fair
enough. So let me offer just this quick description, and you tell me if I'm wrong. On November 5th, the American people went to the polls, about 40% of them at least, and the winner was Donald Trump, not only in the Electoral College, but in the popular vote, which I think surprised a lot of people. From my point of view as a historian, the people have spoken, and they have returned to office someone that they knew a great deal about. There were no surprises from Donald Trump. We knew exactly what he intended to do, and now he appears to be trying to do it.
I understand your perspective. The corrective I would add to that is that Donald Trump received fewer votes to win in this election than he received when he lost the election in 2020. That the winner of the election, that the American people didn't show up in great number. And there really was a pox on both your houses kind of mentality. I think that you could talk about why Harris didn't win, but that what we're talking about is a deeply divided electorate that doesn't trust government at all, no matter who's in charge. And as one of the major believers in climate change, it upsets me to believe that the price of eggs is more important than the face of the planet, or the fate of the planet. And I think that we can say that the American educational system has failed us, the American legal system has failed us, the reporters have failed us. There's so much ignorance out there and so much misinformation out there. People don't get their news on news normal ways. There's no Walter Cronkite. They get it on the internet. And if you gathered the founders together up there in heaven or in hell, wherever they are, and said, we want to explain this thing to you, this thing called the internet, they would say, you are screwed.
Why? Why would they say that, Joe?
Because they don't believe in democracy in the way that we do. Maybe Jefferson did, but none of the rest of them did. We're a republic, res publica, things of the public. The public is interested, is different from the people. And the most important value is virtue. virtue means doing what's in the long-term interest of the public, and in any given moment, most of the public doesn't know what that is.
That sounds to me like an indictment of my hero, Thomas Jefferson, because he believed, A, that the people were up to it, and B, that they had massive good sense even when they weren't particularly well informed, and C, that they would always in the end do the right thing, and that it was worthwhile to trust them to govern themselves through this semi-democratic system we have built.
Yeah, but he only thought that worked in small areas,
right?
Like Indian tribes and towns. And once you get past that, the person who's your representative is nobody you know. And ultimately he said that the only form of a government is self-government. And if you leave everybody alone, they'll interact and get along, and it won't be bad. And Adams, as you know, didn't have that view of human nature. Not too many other people did either. But you know about a lot about Mr. Jefferson, and you know that I don't think we should be tearing down the Jefferson Memorial or anything like that these days. But with regard to this election, I think that you're right. The American people have chosen a man who is different from anybody else who's ever been elected president. One of the thoughts that occurred to me in thinking about this program was to say that the United States is truly distinctive because it's never been in this situation before, whereas most of the modern nations who have become dictatorial are former monarchies. Russia, China, North Korea, even Central European country. That the United States has never had a government that's a monarchical government. And in fact, they came into existence rejecting that very model. So it's going to put us to a real test. And I think what we're going to see is some pretty interesting moments here. And historians are really great at predicting the past. We're almost omniscient in that regard. We're not much better than anybody else at predicting the future. And all I can say is I foresee chaos.
I'm talking to my very good friend, Dr. Joseph Ellis, the author of so many great books. My favorite is on John Adams, but I love your American Sphinx, the character of Thomas Jefferson, his excellency, about George Washington, Revolutionary Summer, about those first difficult months when we nearly lost the war in 1776 and really survived mostly by luck. You've written so many important books, Joe. You're at the crown of an incredible career. Your op-ed pieces are solicited from newspapers and other institutions around the country. I know that you are a citizen. You and I are. We're both older white men. You are an academic. You are a historian.
Yeah, I got a PhD from Yale and taught history for 45 years. Now I live in Middle Maine, on top of a mountain, even though I was born in Virginia and raised there and went to William and Mary. But now I'm a Vermonter. And how do you describe yourself?
I'm a Dakotan. I'm a centrist in Dakota, and Dakota is not a centrist state.
What does centrist mean?
It means that so let me give you my creed, and then I want to hear your creed. I believe that most Americans are somewhere in the broad middle, that there is an extreme group on both sides of the spectrum, the far right and the far left. I lean a little towards the progressive side, but I try to keep my mind open. And I'm trying to analyze this election as a historian more than as a citizen. And I know you struggle with that too. As citizens, we have views. As historians, we're meant to have clarifying insights. And so I'm really eager to hear your insights. But let me give you one proposition, and you run with it for a minute.
Okay.
There's a worldwide rightist reaction going on, which probably is frustration over globalization. It's frustration over the rapidly changing economic world and the coming of AI. It's also actuated by fear of mass migrations from the southern parts of the planet towards the more temperate parts, and that this reaction has been going on for a while. Brexit is one part of that, but we see it in France, we see it in Germany, we see it all over, and of course here in the United States, and that we must look upon our own rightist trajectory as part of whatever that worldwide reaction is. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, it does, and I don't disagree with anything you just said. Yeah. And but given that complex set of conditions, My hope is that the United States maintains its posture as a nation that is attempting to sustain a certain set of values. Those values have to do with human equality. They oppose tyrannies and they oppose crazies, and that we have a role to play in that regard, and that I'm unclear as to whether or not the current occupant of the White House agrees with that, and therefore I'm disappointed. But I think that whether or not this next 2 to 4 years, the forces of the values I believe in aren't dead. They're under stress. And I still believe that when I die, they'll still be alive.
So, Joe, my proposition number one is that we're part of a worldwide phenomenon, and it's bewildering, but I think I've mentioned some of the factors of it. Number two, the founding fathers, of which you are one of the greatest experts in the world, designed a system which was meant to prevent any single entity or any single person from having too much power. So Adams used to say to Mr. Jefferson, checks and balances, Mr. Jefferson, checks and balances. So we have these guardrails that are built into the Constitution. And in my opinion, in Trump term number one, the guardrails barely held, and he ended it with an armed insurrection, which he didn't necessarily touch off, but he certainly didn't discourage. Do you think the guardrails that the founding fathers created are sufficient for the times in which we live, in which a president has enormous power, the media exaggerates all that power, so much is at stake in a global community that has cruise missiles and atomic weapons and germ warfare and so on? Do you think that the founding fathers' guardrails are sufficient in our time?
No. Whether they're going to hold again during the next 4 years is an open question. I do think, for example, that the attempt to arrest people who are citizens of the United States is clearly a violation of the Second Amendment. I think that parts of the agenda of the Project 25 agenda that he's putting into place, called Christian nationalism, is a violation of the First Amendment. I spent 3 years at West Point teaching cadets, and I have a lot of confidence in the military's ability to create more red tape than you can ever possibly imagine. But I think that we need new guardrails. We need to revise the Constitution of the United States. Now, anybody that proposes that is clearly acting in a way that is politically ridiculous, because nobody believes that that's possible given the divisions right now. But I would immediately say we need to do away with the electoral college and make a direct election of the president. I think that the founders, if they were looking back at us, say, we can't believe you haven't revised this yet. Madison, just before he died in 1829, was asked how long he thought the Constitution would last. He said, if we're really lucky, 100 years. Jefferson said, and you know this, when asked about the Constitution, he wanted it revised every 20 years. And he said not to revise. He believed in what we call a living Constitution. And to attempt to live by an old document that's long out of date, it's like, as he said, you remember this, an older man trying to wear the sweater he wore as a child. So that one of the legacies of the founders is to revise the very document that they're famous for. And I think that this has to operate outside government for a while, in the intellectual circle, the academic circle, in order to make it a topic that's part of our ongoing conversation.
Joe, we need to take a short break. I'm having a wonderful time catching up with you. It's the first time we've talked since on the other side of the November 2024 presidential election. So many questions I have for you. We'll take a short break. We'll be back in just a moment. I'm talking with Dr. Joseph Ellis, the author of His Excellency, one of the best books ever written about George Washington. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to Listening to America. I'm talking with my friend Joe Ellis. Joe, we've missed you here. So we've been talking about the election. We're trying to keep it in the historical framework, even though we both have strong personal opinions about all of these things. So Joe, historical note here, 2 presidents now have been elected twice, but with an interim between. Grover Cleveland at the end of the 19th century and Donald Trump in the first third of the 21st century. That surprises me. We've had one father and son in John Adams and John Quincy Adams, and another in H.W. Bush and then George Bush. Now we've had this interim. How surprised were you, just not in terms of your own politics, but how surprised were you that the American people, having twice impeached Donald Trump, and he survived each time, of course, and having diselected him pretty resoundingly in 2020, how surprised were you that they reelected him?
To say I was genuinely surprised would be wrong. Given the role of the internet in the shaping of people's political values, where misinformation is the norm. So I wasn't that surprised. This is who we are, a divided country in which a strong group of a minority strongly believes that the American future lies in the past. The majority of women voted for Trump. A lot of women like patriarchy. They're comfortable with that. So, and that's who we are. So I wasn't that surprised.
So that's who we are. That's who we are. That's how I see it, too. The people have spoken. We'll see in 2026, I think now becomes the most important election of our lifetime, because if there's a very good chance, I think, that he will be endorsed again with larger majorities in both houses in 2026. But if he's not, if there's a reaction.
I foresee the Republicans losing the House. I think they'll hold on tenuously to the Senate, but that this House now will block everything. That can't just be done by a wave of the president's hand. And so I see the midterms as a crucial testing point to find out whether the values that Trump attempts to put in place really are popular with all those people that never voted in the first place.
I wanted just a simple answer to this because I don't want to linger here. I think I hear you saying that if we were a better educated people who knew what was actually at stake in the fragility of a republic, we would not have reelected this person. And we did reelect this person, and you can say people are ignorant or they've been hoodwinked, but the fact is, Joe, that almost nobody in America didn't know who Donald Trump was this last November. He had 4 years. He's a loudmouth. He talks all the time. If that's the case, and he is reelected, then that is who we are, isn't it?
Well, he was reelected, and that's who we are. I mean, he tossed, he's the only president in American history to be impeached twice. When the American Historical Association, the committee that rates presidents, rated him, I was on that for 12 years, but not recently. He came in next to last. The pandemic under him killed a lot of people that didn't have to, and he was indicted for a criminal offense by 14 jurors. I mean, no person in American history with that kind of record has ever been elected president. So it tells us that a lot of people are voting against government when they vote for him. They're genuine believers. And then there is the group that's not so large, but is extremely powerful, billionaires, who see in him as salvation. They won't have to pay taxes as well. And so it's a kind of unholy alliance between billionaires on the one hand and working class Americans and living in rural areas on the other hand, who see him as a kind of savior. I think they're wrong, but I don't doubt the sincerity of their convictions.
Agreed. I think that's a wonderful thing for you to say. So let me offer another proposition that, and this is about perception, not necessarily reality. People like strength. They want a strong president. They looked on Joe Biden as a man who had lost a good amount of his mojo, that he was maybe on the road to dementia. He certainly was frail. They didn't see strength, even though there might have been some behind the scenes. And they saw a much stronger human being, about equally old, but much stronger in perception. And all across the world, people are voting for strong men these days. And I think that has a lot to do with what just happened, whether or not that tracks with reality.
It doesn't track with reality in the sense that if Joe Biden if you were to rank one-term presidents in American history, he would be near the top in terms of what he actually achieved. He's not a great campaigner, but all he does is get things done. And if you take a look at what he did achieve, it's incredible and quite remarkable. It's analogous to the achievement of FDR in the 30s. But that's not the news that people know. That's not the news that they get. And some people think if Biden had run, he would have won. because the vote against Harris was a vote against her gender and her race. I don't know. And the Hispanic vote is overwhelmingly against her among males, especially. They would never vote for any woman. The electorate that we have now is the most uneducated electorate in any modern nation in the world. Trump lost the election in 2020 by a huge majority, and yet all of these people believe he won the election. There are many big lies in American history. I don't think it's the greatest. I think the greatest big lie is that the Civil War was not about slavery. But right up there is that Donald Trump won the election. And they believe it.
What do you mean the 2020 election?
Yes.
But as you know, that's how our system works. The Electoral College may be a fossil that needs to be removed, and the small state dominance that goes right back to the Constitutional Convention, that's in the system. So I agree with you. We need to revise the Constitution. But
one of the ironies is that they created this thing called the Electoral College. When the subject came up for how you elect a president, there are many options. He would be elected by the Senate. He would be elected by the state governments. And then it came up, we would be elected popularly. And Madison got up and said, no, we can't do that because the people don't know diddly squat. We've got to have a group of people who we'll call electors who will make the decision. And so they wanted to avoid precisely the problem that we've created. At any rate, it's because that's the reason why number one on my list of constitutional reforms is do away with the Electoral College. But the Republican Party will never allow for that because they will never win a national election if they do that.
It's been since 1992. So what is that? That's 8 years to 2000. That's 30-some years. That's more than one of Mr. Jefferson's generations, almost two, since we've even had an amendment to the thing.
They did not foresee political parties when they wrote the Constitution. In fact, it was Jefferson who said, if I must go to heaven in a party, I prefer not to go at all, as you know, although he creates the first opposition party.
Well, Madison created it and Jefferson signed on.
Well, Madison was following his leader in the process. But we could argue about that till the cows come home. I am interested in how the nation responds to the fact that we're going to have this celebration of the 250th anniversary of independence. And we were both involved in projects that are coming out of that. It is an interesting holiday to celebrate. It's interesting because the person as president is now claiming to be the second coming of George III. Wow. That's an interesting situation to be in and when you celebrate American independence. As you know, because he wrote the document called the Declaration, and most of it is an indictment of George III for and as a good Jeffersonian, you would go along with me in calling for reforms of the Constitution and adjusting. But the thing about Jefferson that's going to always disappoint people is that he really didn't believe that blacks and whites could live together.
Correct.
That's where we've crossed that line now, somewhere in the middle of the 20th century. And that's inevitable now. I mean, in 2045, whites will become a statistical minority in this population.
So as I try to look at what happened as dispassionately as I can, here's what I see. I see that tens of millions of Americans are uncomfortable with the browning of America, with the number of Hispanics in America, the number of people from Central and South America in America, even with the number of Asian people in America, unless they're from Japan. And that anxiety about the browning of America is real. And we have to face that. And I think what we learned beginning with Barack Obama is that the race uneasiness in the country amongst white people is much greater than we had thought. Tens of millions of people feel that they want to live in a white-dominated America, maybe even in a white supremacist America, but they do not want to live in an America where they're a minority. Do you think I'm right about that?
I think you're right about, say, 30 to 40% of the population. I think they're heavily in states of the former Confederacy.
So how do we address these problems? Okay, let me just remind you, the last Constitutional Convention was in 1787. The last amendment was in 1992. Jefferson did not get his way to build in a clause requiring it to be revised every 19 or 20 years. You know how hard it would be to crack that thing open and start fresh. How do we get out of this morass?
Certainly in New England and the West Coast, no problem here. That the epicenter of the Trump base is the former Confederacy.
And the Great Plains.
To some extent, yeah. It's people who are good Americans. And if your truck broke down, they'd be there to help you fix it. But they don't think about things the same way you do. However, what's interesting is that will this level of racist survive when it's not being encouraged, which it is now? Will this endure? I mean, how can we be cheering for all these people at the Olympics? How can we cheer for, Mahomes as quarterback of the Kansas City? How can we see all these actors and actresses win Tony and Academy Awards and cheer for them? How can any SEC football team function? Over half of the players on all those teams are African Americans. So that we've passed that point. We're never going back. And those people that believe that we must will simply need to die out.
Agreed, but they are a very strong force, and they've elected someone who encourages that dark element in the American character. In other words, that dark element in the American character has always been here. And you and I thought that in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and the 2000s that it was ebbing away and we were moving towards a post-racial country, and that we were finally achieving something like Martin Luther King's dream, that everyone would be treated according to their character, and Jefferson's dream that all human beings would be entitled to dignity and respect. I think you and I both, as progressive centrists, thought that was a done deal. And now we're realizing it's not a done deal at all.
Right. There's where historians can't predict the past, the future. They can predict the past. And that we're part of a long-standing American pattern. It's a backlash pattern. Every significant step forward on the racial front has produced a backlash. We're in the fourth backlash now. And that the irony is that the backlash only happens when progress is happening. And then they get scared because, oh my God, Barack Obama, a black guy. And Trump has traded on that and used it. To what extent? This is an enduring presence. To some extent, it's always going to be there in a certain percentage of the population, but they're just going to be outnumbered by blacks. I don't think America's future is behind it. I think and I think it's ahead of us.
I like your analysis that that these progressive eras lead to a reaction, a backlash, and we're in the fourth of those backlashes. Do you think it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or 1 step forward, 2 steps back?
It can go both ways, and I think that certainly the ending Reconstruction was 2 steps back. Okay, we don't know enough about how this chapter is going to play to give an accurate answer to that. My hunch is it's 1 step, 1 step, and but that. If I was the Democratic Party, I would nominate a white male for president in the next election and have a woman as the vice presidential candidate. The governor of Michigan is a great candidate. That they've learned when the Democratic convention ended, they were wagering that we had crossed the line, that we were ready to name a woman who was an African American, who was a mixed race, really. And they were betting on that. And it turns out it wasn't really true. It was close. And remember how she handled herself in the debate against Trump. But people are not ready to accept that yet. And the thing that has somewhere really astounded me is a number of women. And remember, I taught for a long time at Mount Holyoke, which is a distinguished women's college. A number of women, I think, are more comfortable with patriarchy. Remember, Trump won more women in his victory against Clinton, and I'm shocked or just amazed by that. But because those aren't the women that I've I've spent most of my life with, including my wife. But at any rate, you're right to call the fact that who we are as Americans. This could be a whole series, that we could do on this.
I hope we do.
That and one of the things that I can say is that the United States is the first country to be occupied by a person who wants to be a monarch who never had a monarch before. But we're also the first world power to be a democracy. Okay? And democracies are unreliable for the very reason that they're democracies. And we're seeing that now. Are we going to withdraw from NATO? Are we going to go to war with Denmark over Greenland? I mean, come on, give me a break. We're going to steal remember when the debate over the Panama Canal was occurring many years ago, one of the representatives for me had been president of San Francisco State, said, we stole the Panama Canal fair and square, and we're going to keep it. And
I recall this, yes.
Yeah. I don't think we're going to war over any of those things, but that we're going through this time when, what does it mean to be a world power and be a democracy who basically doesn't, remember, for 4 generations have grown up presuming they have no obligation to serve in the military. And I'm a believer in mandatory national service. Military service would only necessarily be one of the options. But I do think we need a civic sense that we lack right now. And I'm willing to do anything that moves us further in that direction.
So, Joe, I agree. National service, Peace Corps, Vista, AmeriCorps, the Red Cross, education, and the military, of course. I think that would be the answer to rebuild the social compact, the idea that everyone is part of a contract with their government, and they expect some things from their government, and they also owe some things to their government. But if John Kennedy were here today and said, ask not what your country can do for you, but for what you could do for your country, he'd be laughed off the dais. Joe, we need to take a short break. When we come back, I want to ask you more about the Constitution of the United States and how we are going to move forward here. Both of us are older American white men, and we're well over half of our lives have been lived. I want to know, as a historian, if you could ever have thought in the earlier decades of your life that it would come to this, that we would be in this kind of proto-monarchical, proto-dictatorial moment. I think it's one of the most astonishing things that I've ever even tried to consider. So let's take a break. When we come back, I'll be talking further with my friend Joe Ellis, who is the author of so many books that you should read, and still more to come, but someone I turn to for wisdom on questions of this magnitude. You're listening to a special edition of Listening to America. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkins, and across from me, my friend Joe Ellis. Joe, you have a new book coming out in September. Ken Burns' epic on the American Revolution will be coming out in September. I know you're in it. I might be in it in a small way. Tell us about your book.
The book that's coming out is called The Great Contradiction, The Tragic Side of the American Founding. Why we failed to reach a just accommodation with the Native Americans and why we failed to put slavery on the road to extinction. My guideline here is a quote from F. Scott Fitzgerald, who said, "The true mark of a truly intelligent person is the ability to hold two contradictory ideas in his or her mind and still function." I'm saying the American Revolution was an extraordinarily triumphant event. It won a successful war against the dominant military and economic power in the world, and it created the first republic, nation-sized republic since Rome, which itself became the model for Europe, who's, the Frenchman who comes over in 1831 says, America is Europe's crystal ball. It's the republic that we created. All those things are enormous achievements. However, the two failures were real tragedies. And the question really is, are they Greek tragedies or are they Shakespearean tragedies? A Greek tragedy is something that's built in. Sic volvere parcas, 'tis the will of the gods. It couldn't be changed by human endeavor. A Shakespearean tragedy is a result of a failure of leadership or moral leadership. And the reader of this book will be able to reach those conclusions. I don't insist on it. What I want is a dialogue on those issues. My own view is that failure to reach a just accommodation with the Native Americans was a Greek tragedy. I don't see how you could have stopped it.
Inevitable. You think it's inevitable that this just is. This could not have been prevented.
Washington makes a heroic effort to try to end it by, in the Treaty of 1790, Treaty of New York, granting land to the Creek tribe that will be theirs forever and to be a model for the future, so that Native Americans, and you can't occupy their land. That's their land. You couldn't enforce it. The streaming numbers, when people want to pursue their happiness, that means pursuing land. And he put as many troops as he could. It was like a sponge trying to control a flood. At any rate, slavery is a different matter, however. I think that proper leadership, it could have gone the other way. Now, remember, in 1776, we began a policy of abolition in all the northern states. Okay, and the first state to become free of slaves was the state I'm in now, Vermont, although it wasn't even a state then. Massachusetts followed, et cetera, et cetera. But what I'm saying is that the failure to end slavery south of the Chesapeake was a serious failure. But the real source of the failure wasn't people wanting slavery per se, but people being unwilling to accept free blacks as equals. That was Jefferson's position, as you know. I want slavery to end, but the only way we can end it is if in Virginia we find a way to send them somewhere else. And that somewhere else kept changing. Versus it might be out there beyond the Mississippi, though we don't own it yet. It might be Puerto Rico, it might be wherever, but in the end, it's back to Africa. So that the racism we were referring to as a current fact in American history has been there since the founding. It's right there beneath the surface of American society. And Jefferson's Jefferson's the Mona Lisa of American history. I mean, is he smiling? And on this score, Monticello is a laboratory on racial mixture. Wow, that's what the book is about.
And so, Joe, both of us want to say it wasn't inevitable, but it almost requires us to agree that what happened was inevitable. And so the question is there any wiggle room in there anywhere? Could certain policies have been different at certain times? Could we have enforced the protection of Oklahoma? Could we have enforced leaving much of the Great Plains to natives? I think that's a long and interesting debate, but leaving it for
19th and 20th century story, and at different places, it could have gone in a different direction. I agree. What I'm saying is at the start, Washington offered an opportunity to create a series of Indian lands that would become states, equal states. And what the Creeks got was all of what is now Alabama and half of Mississippi. That's what they would have got. How would that have played out? Can you imagine? Then they send their representatives to Congress, and it's et cetera, et cetera. History could have gone in that direction. Washington wanted it to go that way. He said it was the greatest defeat of his presidency.
One of the things I love most about your book on His Excellency, which I think is a pioneering book, and I come back to it all the time, is at the end of the book you say, Washington, when he finally retired in 1797, wasn't quite done yet, and he wanted to do two things still, and one of them was figure out some way to coexist with native peoples and not simply roll over them, and the other one was to do something serious about slavery and yet understand how complex that problem was going to be. Jefferson never made any attempts at this sort of thing. Madison made no attempt at this sort of thing. I don't think John Adams had it in him to really address those questions, but Washington was a man of deep conscience, wasn't he?
He was. And he also, very few people know this because I didn't put it in any book, and I found it out myself in the recent research. During his presidency, early on, he told his cabinet, I would like you to know, but keep confidential, if the current regional conflict becomes a civil war, I want you to know I will go with the North. Jefferson heard that and was aghast. And he said, from this point forward, we regard Mount Vernon as a Trojan horse planted in the South. And it's the beginning of his libeling of Washington, which is really not an attractive time. At any rate, you're right. Washington, if you try to measure Washington against the moral values of the present, he's not going to succeed. If you measure him against the other planters of Virginia at that time, he's going to be way ahead. The beauty of the Washington Monument is got no words on it. The Washington Monument is there, and you can read into it whatever in heaven's name you want.
But Joe, go back to Jefferson for just a minute. So, of course, he talks a good game. Jefferson, nobody talks a good game better than Thomas Jefferson. But when he purchased Louisiana from Napoleon, he could have said, and we'll keep slavery out of the Louisiana Purchase. Just the opposite. He worked hard to make sure slavery could go into the southern Mississippi zone. When he talked
mind on that too. I mean, in other words, early on, he thinks this will be a place we can send the Native Americans. And then there's a letter. He says, well, wait a minute. No, we can't send that's where we're going to send the blacks. He frustrates you. You want him to, they're Jefferson haters. And, some historians, he's the ultimate. I'm not in that crowd. You and I are together in thinking. He's one of the most impressive writers, thinkers in the founding generation, and was recognized by his peers for that. But when it comes to the slavery issue, he's going to fail the test. Maybe what we're saying is that if Jefferson were listening to this record, this way you say, you guys were right. Racism is always going to be a part of American society, and blacks are never going to be treated equally. So get over it.
He said that. In Notes on Virginia, he said, this unfortunate business of color. He said, in Rome and in Greece, you could free slaves and they could be incorporated and nobody would know the difference after a generation or two. But here, because slaves are African Americans, they're Africans, that they will never be fully integrated into American social life. I think he might be wrong, but I do think that he was onto something, that the race distinction between the sort of Enlightenment, European, Anglo-derived people who built the 13 colonies, and then the people they imported as brute labor, was such a distinction in color and race, in addition to being a distinction in access to the principles of the Enlightenment, that Jefferson predicted it can never be solved. I think he might be wrong, Joe. I think you think he might be wrong.
I do, but what I'm saying is that you were arguing that maybe it's forever, and you're agreeing with Jefferson on that.
I'm not necessarily, but I think it's. Don't you think that we have to credit him with this? And I'm not trying to defend Jefferson, but he was right when he said, "You have no idea how difficult it's going to be to undo this."
Correct.
That's
right. What you're dealing with here. It's interesting because every other time he's talking about human nature, he seems to have a much more positive and almost excessively positive view of it. But on this issue, he doesn't. I mean, I say Jefferson's like the thing floating above the Super Bowl, sending messages to both sides. And like the interesting thing is both the people on the Southern in the Confederacy and people in the Union Army both thought they were fighting for Jefferson's principles.
Well, his grandson fought for the Confederacy, so I think we know where Jefferson would have been in 1860. So, thinking about the 1619 Project, you said something a little while ago, Joe, that really struck me. You said, right from the beginning, right from the beginning of our national experiment, we've had this issue, this fundamental race issue, and almost everything can be seen through that lens. So the founding fathers in Philadelphia, the southern states said, count us out. We're out of here unless you grandfather slavery in. Slavery is grandfathered in. All the compromises over Western expansion. The South has held the rest of the country hostage from the very beginning, and it continues to do so to this day. They built into the Electoral College, they built into the formula of the Senate ways in which they could protect what they called their peculiar institution. And so I do believe that this has been the besetting problem of American life. So you see that, and I see that, Joe, but why is there such a fierce reaction to the 1619 Project as if it's some sort of Maoism or radical Leninism?
Among some historians, the reaction, I haven't been in that group, but because the New York Times wants to be politically correct, it is being historically incorrect. The first blacks to come to Virginia didn't come in 1619. The ones that came in 1619 and the ones that were there then were not enslaved. Slavery didn't exist in Virginia until 1662, not for any moral reason, but because people died so early that it didn't pay to buy a slave when you can have an indentured servant. And 2/3 of the whites who came over as part of the movement towards Virginia were all indentured servants too. Secondly, 1776 wasn't a total failure. The slavery did stop in all the states north of the Chesapeake. And the reason it could happen there is that only 10% of the African American population lived there. The underlying premise of the 1619 and 1776 is what's called structural racism, or that's true, that's correct, but the way they're looking for a way to get a handle on it on certain dates, and they pick the wrong handles.
Okay, so maybe there's some mistakes in the historiography, but the basic premise, I think, is irrefutable, that you cannot understand the history of the United States without race at the center of all of your discourse.
Everything I've written recently confirms that.
And so, and so, the people that want us, let's just say the ideological right wants to shame that proposition and say, oh, come on, it's not so. Look at all the progress we've made, and that's just not fair. That's the wrong lens to wear, and you're distorting all the facts. I think they're palpably wrong, Joe. I think that race has been the issue from the beginning, and it has reared its head again beginning in 2016. Trump trying to persuade the country that Obama was not an American is part of that same game. And that we have to face this. And it doesn't mean that we have to wring our hands or throw ourselves on a sword or, apologize through the roof or do reformations. But how can we go on as a nation if we don't use the 250th birthday of the Republic to be honest about this race problem that has bedeviled American life?
I completely agree, and I intend to use my whatever effort I have. I think you're going to see this in the Ken Burns movie, and that's going to have a lot of influence. And I think that as we move forward as a nation, understanding that this is the central feature of our history, it is, I think, right now politically impossible for a serious national candidate to come out in a pure racist form. It has to be disguised. It cannot be explicit. It has come to be difficult, if you wish to have a national political identity, to explicitly say you're a racist, to explicitly say that you believe these are inferior people.
Correct. But how many times historically, and especially in the last 50 years, have we said that kind of racism is in its last gasp? And then we have to wake up and realize, well, not quite. It's not quite yet in its last gasp.
That's where we're at. We're saying, oh, geez, here it comes again.
Joe, we just have a couple of minutes left. Let me turn the subject a little bit. Just so the demographics are not on the side of a white supremacist nation. The demographics are going to change all of that. They've already mostly changed it. And
the closer we get to that, the more the backlash.
Right. So you're seeing this kind of rage and paranoia and anxiety about this, and so the people that believe that are trying to shore up the system so that it can protect a white minority against the tide of the demographics that are coming. How are we as a people going to turn this around and move towards a more tolerant, a more respectful, a more generous, a more accepting, enlightened population that is not afraid as much as some of us seem to be?
Some of the things we've referred to earlier in our discussion are relevant. Civics education at the state level and at the high school level and at the college level. National service encouraged, done in such a colleges have priced themselves out of the middle class, by the way. It's crazy the cost of college these days. So I would like a program for national service in which for 3 years you get free tuition. So there's some practical things to do, but the more long-term answer is we know we're going to win. It's going to take a long time. Be patient, be insistent. Probably not in our lifetimes. but that's where history's headed. American history he's trying to turn it around. No successful political movement in American history has ever turned history around. And I don't think this one will either.
So I think I hear you saying that the long view is a relatively optimistic and positive one, but we're in for some craziness in the short term. And did you expect towards the end of your life, I hope you live 25 more years, but did you expect that this would ever happen to the United States?
No. Neither did you. Of course not. We couldn't foresee this future. So I think that for me, the war in Vietnam for the first time shook me about who we were as a people. I rebelled against the sort of Southern value of American history at William and Mary. And I was present at the King's speech in the Lincoln Memorial, the I Have a Dream speech.
Wow.
And I sat in the reflecting pool next to Wilt Chamberlain. Also, we missed the speech. We were at the end of the parade. We missed the speech. But in other words, my life is coming in and out of all this stuff. But I have confidence that the United States will eventually recover an identity that is more attractive on the racial front and more attractive as what leadership means at the international level.
And do you think, as a closing question, we just have a few seconds left, that tattered though they are, the guardrails are going to hold us through this period so that we can go on the other side?
I would say 70% sure, but not completely. He could try, he could succeed, but he's only going to be one term. Now, there's already talk that he could write, but this, again, a violation of the amendment passed in 1951. And I think we'll see the end of the Trump success in legislation with the midterms.
We'll leave it at that. We'll see. I want to hold you to that. We'll come back to look at it in January of 2027. But before that,
if we're still here, promise me we'll be able to talk about. You can replay this and find out whether I'm right or not.
Yeah, well, exactly. I will hold us both to account. So, Joe Ellis, thank you so much. It's so great to have you back. I'd like to meet with you on this program about once every 5 weeks in the year 2025. Does that work for you?
I think so. I mean, I can't predict whether I'm going to be alive within 2 weeks, but yeah, I got nothing wrong with me. I'm going to be busy doing stuff, but never too busy for an hour talk with you.
I so enjoy it, and this is the first time we've talked in a while, but it's the first time ever that your dogs have not made themselves known on this program, so that you must be doing something right.
Yeah, they left the room for some reason.
I guess they got tired of us. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of Listening to America.